TV side, you want to be an executive producer. And the reason you don't want to be an executive producer in film is because if the project gets nominated, it's only producers, not executive producers, who get nominated. With an independent film, sometimes you'll see, I'm making it up, 12 or more producer names. Oh my God, how come so many producers? Well, they all put up some money and they all get to invite their friends to the premiere.
What's that saying? Success has many fathers, right?
Failure has none.
Hello, friends. I'm Kent Barton, and welcome to the Overview podcast. Here at Overview, our mission is to give you insights and learnings to help you think more clearly about the world we live in and navigate the future more successfully. And what better way to do that than to connect you with guests who have remarkable stories to tell? And with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Bob Bookman to today's show. Bob has spent roughly half a century in the movie business with a focus on turning great books into even greater films. He was instrumental in the creation of Silence of the Lambs, Jurassic Park, A Beautiful Mind, A Complete Unknown, to name just a few. So if you ever wondered about the inner workings of Hollywood, Bob's your man. But in fact, he's actually still working in the business, running his own operation out of the Sony lot in LA. What struck me as I was kind of prepping for this conversation, at the core of this really remarkable career lies like a deep and abiding love for the art and craft of storytelling. And boy, does Bob have some stories to tell. And I think we'll also try to get his takes on the latest changes in the movie business, of which there are quite a lot, some of which to stand to fundamentally even alter the business at its core. Bob, it's great to have you with us today. How's it going?
Thank you, Kent. I'm really glad to be with you, and all well on this end. We got a cloudy day in Southern California, but otherwise everything's good.
Excellent. Well, great. We'll jump right in here. So, you've had a heck of a consequential career in Hollywood, and my intro really barely scratched the surface and didn't do it justice. But before we go anywhere near your back catalog and your whole story, I want to know, what are you working on right now? What's on your desk this week?
Well, actually, I have a lot of projects, and to put it in a larger context, and which you hinted at about the issues facing Hollywood right now, my line, and it's only half facetious, is that I'm working harder to accomplish less. And you say that to people here and they go, me too, and in whatever they're doing. And it really was kicked off, I think, originally by COVID. We then had the writers and the actors strikes. We then had the streamers cutting back on production. And those are just some of the headline reasons that things have fallen. And what I tend to do, which is more elevated projects and often period projects. I was a history major in college and have always been fascinated by history. That those are really the hardest things to get made. And right now, for example, we've made a deal at Searchlight, which is originally was Fox Searchlight, and when Disney bought Fox, it became Searchlight as part of Disney, but they're the ones that made A Complete Unknown. And we had a great experience with them. So I represented Tom Stoppard as an agent who, just died a few months ago last year. I thought, in spite of my being his agent, the single greatest writer in English living, and maybe certainly one of the greatest ever. Anyway, the only play of his that he had ever sold the film rights to was The Real Thing, which was a play he wrote in the early 80s in answer to critics who felt he was this genius writer but never touched the human heart. And this was the play that showed he touched the human heart. And it was bought by Universal for Sidney Pollack and was never made. It was then passed over to Harvey Weinstein at Miramax, where it was never made. It was then passed over to Gary Barber at Spyglass, who generally didn't make things. He more bought and sold things. So they had the rights when I went with, sorry to drop a big name, Mick Jagger and Victoria Pearman, who runs his production company, Jagged Films, to get Tom's blessing to make it as a movie now. And we got the great screenwriter Jez Butterworth, who's currently writing it and, like many writers, is overdue on delivering it. And Joe Wright, the celebrated director, attached to direct it. And we in Searchlight are waiting for Jez's script. And it's more of a not a sort of single character, that's more of an ensemble. There's four major roles, so casting at this point isn't as important and will certainly not be a problem given the elements. So that's probably the most thing that's progressed the most and which I'm really excited about. I'm also very excited about the book by Jonathan Friedland, who's a journalist at The Guardian, called The Escape Artist. And it's the story of a man originally named Walter Rosenberg, later named Rudolf Verba, who was the first of as few as four Jews to escape from Auschwitz. And it's just an extraordinary, extraordinary story, which I'm really excited about. And another one I'm excited about is, I'm going to drop a name probably nobody on the broadcast has ever heard of, and that's Doc Pomus. Doc Pomus would be 100 if he were still alive today. He was born in Brooklyn in 1925, middle class, upper middle class Jewish family. And when he was 7 or 8, there was a polio epidemic. And his parents, fearing for his health, sent him to a camp in Connecticut where, ironically and tragically, he contracted polio. And by the time he recovered, he had been in an iron lung. He could only walk with braces and crutches. And he was this sort of paunchy, short, disabled Jewish kid who fantasized being a blues singer. So he hung out in blues clubs. And a few years later, the eminent Big Joe Turner and he had become friends. And he said to Big Joe, I really want you to help me set up my own blues group. And he said, well, you have a big problem. And he goes, what's that? He goes, well, your name's Jerome Felder. You can't have a blues group if your name's Jerome Felder. So he changed his name to Doc Pomus. That's where the name comes from. And he met a guy and really played very well. There's a documentary his daughter Sharon made called AKA Doc Pomus. And you see him playing in these clubs, and he really was very talented. And at one point, Big Joe came to him and he says, Doc, you're not doing badly as a Jewish black blues singer, but I think your real calling is as a songwriter. And he met a guy named Morty Schumann, and they became one of the key songwriting teams in the Brill Building. And if you Google Doc, you'll see Elvis songs, Drifter songs, Dion songs, Ray Charles. It's just extraordinary what they wrote, but most importantly, Save the Last Dance for Me. And Doc wrote it because he couldn't dance with his wife Willie at his own wedding. And that's the emotional core of the movie we're trying to make. So those are just three examples of what I'm working on, all which I think, if they got made, would be well received, but at this stage, really, really tough to get made.
Wow, yeah, a lot on your plate. That sounds like fun. And one thing that occurs to me, Bob, a common thread throughout a lot of what you just mentioned is music,
Yeah,
blues singer and songwriter. Uh, a lesser known figure named Mick Jagger, underground
yeah,
guy,
right.
and
Yeah,
then of course complete unknown. That's actually a great jumping off point for some questions I had.
sure.
Just jumping into that, not only is this a recent film that you were so involved in getting over the finish line and getting into production, and of course that really resonated with people, but the, I think that tension. There's one of the central themes of that movie is this tension between here's Bob Dylan and he's embracing this new technology and new sound to go electric, and the folk scene at the time was sort of anathema to the folk scene. Well, you can't do that. You got to stick with your acoustic. That's how Bob Dylan initially became popular, but it sort of prefigures in a way, and it falls neatly into this idea of like what's happening now in the movie business, and it really in music and other areas too, where technology in various ways is changing the game again. And that's some stuff I want to dig into shortly. But just for starters, were you a Dylan fan back in the day?
Yeah, always,
What's your
especially
favorite
early
album
days.
by Bob?
Blonde on Blonde. Double album, but still. My roommates and I, we used to sing Memphis Blues, together all the time.
Yeah.
Oh, Mama, can this really be the end? To be stuck inside in Mobile with the Memphis Blues again? Yeah, I don't think I'm gonna make the cut.
We could do some karaoke. The
Yeah,
nice
there
thing
you
about
go.
Bob is he doesn't go too high, just kind of sing along with his
Yeah,
style. I think mine is "Blood on the Tracks." Like "Tangled Up in Blue" is such a
yeah, great
beautiful
song.
song and a good story. So okay, kind of talking about Complete Unknown. So if I remember correctly, kind of just researching the backstory here, Complete Unknown was a story that had been kind of potentially wilting on the vine for a while, but then it actually took Searchlight to bring it over the finish line, as opposed to going somewhere else. But like with that particular film, what did you see in Searchlight that mattered more than just like a stronger financial offer? Because you must have seen like, okay, they can really realize the vision better than perhaps another partner with this.
Well, the irony is that we only had two offers, and we had Timothy Chalamet, who wasn't Timothy Chalamet that he is today yet, and I was astonished because I thought it would be much more competitive. And the other irony is that Searchlight's offer was much lower than the other offer, which came from Amazon. But we had all seen how streamers had failed to support motion pictures as they deserved to be supported. And I think it was unanimous going with Searchlight instead. And I think Amazon's offer across the board was at least half again as much. And I can only rave about how Searchlight handled this, from how much money they put up to the marketing to just everything was supporting Jim. They brought Jim Mangold in fact, who couldn't have been a better choice.
Kind of like at a high level, what is when a partner like Searchlight, what do they do different than say like just somebody with a lot of money will do? You alluded to like marketing, and is it
Well, they
like
also have
how is
distribution. They have distribution. So you don't have to worry about selling it to distributors or whatever. It's one stop shopping. But it's also the experience of their executives. I'll give you an analogy that I often use when people ask me about how you submit things. And I say, think of the movie business as a series of concentric circles, and you want to deal in the circle closest to the center. So the circle closest to the center are the major studios who are also distributors. Then the next circle might be major studios who don't have their own distribution. Then it might be independents who have distribution deals. But pretty soon, when you get like the fifth or the sixth ring, you're dealing with marginal people. And so you should have expectations of marginal results, or people not being candid with you, or all kinds of other things that sort of are the legend of the movie business, but in fact don't happen so much at the core of it. And that really is the challenge, is to find the right person. And Amazon versus Searchlight was clearly the one closer to the core.
interesting? And kind of on a related note, how most big studios like with Searchlight, which is that's Fox, correct?
No, it's
Um,
now Disney. It
or
was
Disney.
Fox,
Okay,
but
it
yeah,
was Fox.
it's now,
No,
and
Disney.
they're on the Disney.
Oh,
They moved their offices to the Disney lot.
oh, interesting. Okay. So most studios, have their own indie houses, and I've always enjoyed that because, like, if I'm watching, sort of something from a boutique studio, sub studio, for lack of a better term, they tend to be more interesting. They're not so likely to be big action movies or something. They're more
Right.
nuanced. But how do they specifically do things different at those boutique houses?
Well, what they have to do I mean, A24, Neon, I think those are the kinds that you're talking about. But there's also Focus, which is part of Universal, and Screen Gems, which is part of Sony Columbia. So those are all in house companies. Uh, but A24 and also Neon clearly made a mark if you look at the Best Picture nominations this past year. So they don't have necessarily have a distribution, and certainly they don't have foreign distribution, so they either have in-house or they have a deal with a major foreign sales agent. It's just and about getting it out there, and They may or may not have an in-house marketing team. It's each company is structured a little differently, and you look at who everything about my business is about relationships, and that drives everything. And sometimes when you wonder, how did that happen? Well, the answer is because of a relationship you weren't aware of. And when I was first starting out, originally in the agency business, I was a television packaging agent because it was the only job I could get at the time. And then when I made the transition over to the motion picture side, Mike Metaboy, who's still around, was head of the motion picture department in the agency, and then went to be head of West Coast production for United Artists. And he was a great mentor. And he said, I'm only going to give you one piece of advice. There are only 200 people in the motion picture business who matter. Make a list of them and meet them all. And obviously, it didn't happen overnight. But if you talk to people in the business, one of the things they'll say about me, oh, Bob Bookman, he knows everybody. Or Bob Bookman, he has great relationships. And they don't always connect that to why I'm still here. But that really is a fundamental aspect of the business, is who you know, not what you know.
I'm sort of envisioning this nice, neat framework that you sort of outlined between this 200 people aspect, but also the concentric circles. You can imagine some people closer to the
Right.
center and moving out. I imagine, just inevitably, of course, over the time you've been in the industry, the specific people in that 200, that cohort of 200 has probably changed a lot. But do you feel like that's still the case? Does that still hold true? Where in the Hollywood world, there's this kind of fairly tight knit group of maybe a couple hundred people, or has that sort of changed over time? Do you think that's still accurate even in modern like today's
Yeah, I
Hollywood?
do, because I think it's inherent in the culture. And I think it's very hard to change cultures, whether they're social cultures or business cultures or industrial cultures. And I think it's just not who they are literally, because Mike gave me that advice more than 50 years ago, but more the fact that you have the streamers now. Back then, there was really a wall between film and television that virtually nobody crossed over. And if they did, it was only one direction. And I would say the big change has been in the last 10 years or whatever it is, of television becoming so important, attracting so many high end film people, and vice versa. But it's still, when you add up the number of names, it's probably not that different.
Interesting. And maybe that will change now that the Amazons of the world and Skydancer and things are getting a little bit more complex now. I I have some deep questions around that for a little bit later because it's I actually was shocked by how much things are consolidating in the space and the role of tech today. But kind
Which
of
we
keep
spoke about when I came to Denver, when I met you. And that was the subject, was consolidation. And interestingly, I have a friend named Rory Marmer, who for a long time was a prominent motion picture producer, and he was hired by Netflix. He's still there, amazingly, after however many years. And I went to see him about a week or so after he had gone there, and he said, I almost walked out the door at the end of my first day. And I go, why? He says, this isn't an entertainment company, this is a tech company. And he went into a lot of detail about why it was. And I think that's one reason why there's a inherent mistrust or hesitation in terms of dealing with the streamers, because they don't really committed to releasing films theatrically.
okay.
I
And
was
so you
involved.
touched on
Yeah.
one of the core questions I have around all this because um, you could argue. So I'm of the view that as somebody who's external to the film world, and I certainly have a lot of favorite movies, but somebody who's kind of watched this from a distance and is kind of aware of the general trend. I believe 2025 was the worst box office in a few decades, and there's a lot of maybe factors. You alluded to some of them, COVID and this and that. But I would argue that like one of the problems is maybe people simply aren't buying what Hollywood is selling. Present company accepted. Like you've been involved in some amazing
No,
things,
no,
but
you don't have to
specifically,
say
I'm
that.
talking about IP overload. Like just how many Marvel movies can you make? How many people are just milking that IP cow, or studios are? And I would venture to guess uh, that maybe people are tiring of this, and they're craving real stories. So potentially, maybe with the rise of the streaming kind of angle, there could be more opportunity for like interesting stories to get made, albeit maybe you're sacrificing distribution. Maybe these aren't in actual movie theaters, but like, what do you? There's a lot to unpack there.
Let me give
What do
you
you
an
think about all
example. I'll give you an example. This is an extreme example, but those are always the best ones. So I sold an article to the New Yorker, I'm going to say over 25 years ago, and it was called The Burial. And it is the story of a guy named Willie Gary, who was a black lawyer from Florida, who was the first person in his family to even go to high school, I think. And he was hired by a sixth generation white funeral home owner in Mississippi to represent him against a big Canadian conglomerate that was basically trying to crush him. And it's the ultimate David and Goliath story. I met Willie. He's an extraordinary person. I sold the rights outright in, I'm going to say 2000, right? Maybe it was 1999. It took 25 years to get the movie made. One of the reasons was because I had sold the rights outright, because that means the original company controls the rights unless there's a reversion within the agreement, which there wasn't, basically until the copyright expires. So what happened was, we finally got it set up at Amazon, and it was made with Tommy Lee Jones and Jamie Foxx. It got rave reviews. It was released in October, so it was up for Academy consideration. They yanked it after a week in the theaters with no support, threw it up online for streaming, and I don't think anybody ever saw the film. And I think, apropos of what you're saying about the kinds of films that would now get attention, that's the kind of film that would. And if they had supported it, if it wouldn't have gotten Academy nominations, would have gotten serious Academy consideration. Your witness.
Yeah, it must be disheartening in a sense that if you put a lot of time and thought and effort and finances behind a film, only to have it sort of pulled from that sort of pedestal of visibility, namely in the theaters. Um, regarding the IP thing, I guess I have two questions for you. Like, how did we get here to the point where Hollywood became kind of strayed from this beautiful tradition of, like, storytelling, and there's so many examples. You've been involved with so many, and into the kind of just ham-fisted, the IP driven, very, action oriented. You have romantasy these days and other stuff too. Sci-fi. I love sci-fi personally, but like, how do we get there, and what needs to change in Hollywood to kind of bring storytelling back?
Well, I think very, very good question, and you raise a number of issues that I might need my crystal ball, which is in the shop right now, to answer accurately. But I would say that 40 years ago, let's say, it was action movies. They weren't Marvel movies or DC movies. They were action movies that I used to think was that there were two kinds of businesses. There was the movie business and there was the action movie business. And there was very little overlap. And today you can almost see that there's the movie business and there's the deep IP driven movie business, by which I mean Marvel and DC. But it's tough for them to come up with Star Wars. It's really tough to come up with new ones because the movies are very expensive. I'm guessing, average $200 million to cost, and that's before marketing. And remember, I don't know if everybody realizes, when you read about grosses and you say the movie made $100 in theaters this week, well, only half of that on average goes back to the distributor. So you have to remember, half is kept by the theaters, and the theaters are not owned by the studios, going back to the 1948 Paramount Consent Decree. So they're looking for And I would also say another issue is about who is attracted to those. I would say mostly younger people. I mean, there are demographic, uh, basically you have males, females, under 25, over 25. There are more subcategories, but those are the big categories. And to get those males under 25, basically you want to get them out of the house. On date night, they're not going to want to hang around the house. They may even been living with their still living with their parents. So there's that opportunity. And it's also an economic one. I think from what I've been reading about costs of going to theater, the costs are going up, which means there may be a competitive thing. Maybe it has to do with video games. I don't know. It has bowling that will attract people more than going to movies. And so these are all factors. I think in terms of more, for want of a better word, upscale, literate kinds of movies that we all grew up on. I mean, to Sidney Pollack movies, if you will. Those movies are almost impossible to get made today. I would say Complete Unknown is one of the few movies that fits into that category. So they're mostly lower budgeted films, and they can't spend a lot on marketing because it's about, is the audience going to wait to watch it on streaming, or they're going to come out and see it in the theater? Another interesting statistic is the percentage of people that go out to a movie without already knowing what they're going to see. In other words, let's go to a movie, let's go to the mall, whatever it is, and see what's playing. That is falling each year, which means it's more about attracting people to a specific film. So this is just sort of a mosaic, if you will, of the issues, and it forms a picture that's ever changing.
Kind of on another note related to the economics of all this. You said previously, maybe it was here in Denver or maybe on a different show. You mentioned that with Netflix, it's basically, and maybe the other streamers, it's basically a buyout.
Yeah.
There's no back end with that. So for somebody who's really built a career on residuals and back end participation, like what does it mean for the economics of authorship when the dominant buyer like doesn't share upside? How does that work and change things?
Devastating. Devastating. And it may come down to it gets made that way or it doesn't get made. And that would be another reason why we didn't go with Amazon. And in fact, the movie's profitable, Complete Unknown. So what you're saying is it makes a huge amount of sense. And I think that there are now some variations on that because I think Netflix, especially with their announcing they're going to be more involved theatrically, that there may be some kind of back end again. But it still begs a bigger question, and it's one of the reasons the industry is hurting now. There's no more TV packaging, but that came out of the WGA agreement 3 years
I
ago.
wonder if the streamers neglect that side too much. I wonder if a separate sort of niche away from these giant, powerhouses, these massive tech companies will form to meet those needs, or
Mhm.
maybe, we'll get the opposite where there just isn't. We're sort of continually starved for this. My gold standard, Bob, with like an amazing director, amazing, just amazing movies is like Quentin Tarantino. I came of age in the '90s, and Reservoir Dogs, Pulp
Yeah.
Fiction, Jackie Brown, like these, and the contrast to your typical. I don't want to paint with too broad of a stroke, but your typical movie today, the contrast between those two couldn't be greater. I'm a fan of whatever is going to has to happen to bring that type of movie making back because I would again I would guess a lot of people have an appetite for that. So it's a shame that that need is being underserved right now in the market.
Well, I would say to you that, for want of a better word, Quentin Tarantino is an artist. He's not just a filmmaker or a craftsman, or, I mean, he is truly an artist. And at any given time, if you look historically, there are never that many of them. And it may be about, he periodically announces he doesn't want to make any more movies. But if he makes a movie, I mean, there are people standing there to make it with him. But it's about who else? Christopher Nolan, those are really big movies, right? And there are a few others, but it's tough. Peter Jackson.
Kind of on a related note, the idea of director, producer, like is somebody who is a real visionary. I I'm wondering, like, sort of what is the actual role of a producer? What do they do? Like, so uh, I don't have a ton of experience in Hollywood, but through a weird chain of events, I actually was able to have lunch one time as a young college kid with Howard Kazanjian, the producer of Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi at the Paramount commissary, and I was so curious, and as a real Star Wars fan, I was so excited to be chatting with him. But I said, so what did you do, and what do you do as a producer, Howard? And I remember he sort of traced a outline with his hands of like the Paramount arches over in the side there, and he said, "Well, it's all about like having a vision and making sure it happens." And that always stuck with me. But producer
Pretty
sounds like
vague.
both a yeah, it's vague, but also it seems like it's maybe also changed over time. From my perspective, it sounds like it's more just like, are you financing a film? And of course, you do have producer credit like on Complete Unknown, but like, what does a producer do these days? What does it mean to be have that title?
Well, not the problem, but the issue is that there's no single definition of what a producer does. Just to give you an extreme example, this was a long time ago. I had a meeting with Steve Blauner, who was the S of BBS, which made all those, they made Easy Rider and all those Bob Rafelson films and everything. He was terrific. And I went in, and they had just done the Peter Bogdanovich film, the first one he did that really put him on the map. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, it was based on a book, and Steve Friedman had been a lawyer, and now he decided to want to be a producer and had optioned the rights. And Steve Blauner's almost like smoke coming out of his ears. Do you realize if we're nominated for an Oscar, he gets to go up there and get it because the price of our buying the rights from him was that he got producer credit? So you have to
That
start with the right. I mean, let's start at the beginning. The process of making a movie is acquisition, right? Development, production. And then you got post and all that. But those are really the three stages of getting a movie made. And at each stage, somebody or more than one person is going to attach themselves as a producer, depending on what their leverage is and what their contribution is. But someone like Howard Kazanjian, in my opinion, is a glorified line producer, which can get producer credit, or they might get executive producer credit if they're high profile. But all that means is basically they're responsible for the nuts and bolts. They actually don't make creative decisions unless it might be who should we hire, to do the production design or whatever, which would still be in consultation with the studio and the director. But as opposed to, I mean, honestly, my role as producer is I was on the set only because I was a producer and I got to go, but I didn't do anything really when I was on the set. I'd done my job. I'd put it together and sold it to Searchlight. And so I deserve producer credit for that. So it's about what function you form, what your previous credits are in terms of precedent, and what you can get in the negotiation for your services. Does that make any sense? And on
yes, it does.
TV
Thanks for
side,
clarifying.
TV side, you want to be an executive producer. And the reason you don't want to be an executive producer in film is because if the project gets nominated, it's only producers, not executive producers, who get nominated. With an independent film, sometimes you'll see, I'm making it up, 12 or more producer names. Oh my God, how come so many producers? Well, they all put up some money and they all get to invite their friends to the premiere.
What's that saying? Success has many fathers, right?
Failure has none.
Failure has. I don't know about that one. Yeah, that wasn't me. In terms of like kind of coming back to one of the real core themes that, and you perhaps have one of the most apropos names of anybody in the business, Bob Bookman. But books, bringing books to life in movie form has been really one of your core
Mm-hmm.
competencies and things that you've really done. Just thinking back to like this just occurred to me because it's one of my all-time favorite movies, but and also based on a book, Apocalypse Now. Um, was this something when you were did this have an impact on you when you were younger? Also, as growing out of Heart of Darkness, was this sort of an inspiration in certain ways? I know that's an oddly specific question, but the movie is so amazing it deserves a question.
I would say it has earned its reputation in over time. Because when it came out, it was mostly about all the outrages of actually making it and all of the stunts and everything that Coppola did. And it wasn't ultimately because it wasn't a big success. I don't think it was a failure. I think it was like a success to Steam, but it wasn't like, oh my God, this is transforming movies. That sort of slowly came after.
Interesting how it's almost like a bottle of wine or something, it sort of
Yeah.
ages with time and perceptions change. I know, yeah,
Or,
that
or it
production
could,
was fraught with
yeah, or it
problems.
could be rotten in the bottle. I was at a
Yeah,
wine dinner 2 nights ago in which there was by its label, a great wine that was undrinkable.
that's always the wine roulette, isn't it? Like
Yeah,
on paper, it's going to
yeah,
be a great
yeah.
bottle.
Someone said
Um,
there are no great wines, only great bottles.
it reminds me of album covers.
Yeah,
It's always
you
always
can't
fun to
tell
look
a
at.
record by its cover. Yeah.
Exactly. Kind of along the same lines of like the book to film aspect. So there's many books out there, many manuscripts, but like, what do you look for in a book that just like screams, I need to be a movie? Because that you could argue that a lot of excellent books, maybe they're more internal narrator
Yeah,
stuff,
I agree.
mind blowing, but they don't make perhaps great films because it's too internal. But like, what is that right balance for you that says yes, this has to be a film?
No, I think that's a really good question. And what you said about great books not making great movies goes along with that, for just the reason you said. I mean, it's a different form. And the issue, in fact, in adapting a book in particular for a film is to be true to the spirit of the book without being true to the letter of the book. And so it was interesting as an agent representing the writers of the books in terms of how I got them to understand that. But what I would say I would look for, I like stories that take you somewhere you haven't been before. I like stories that have complex, flawed heroes. I like stories that have a lot of interesting conflicts that don't necessarily resolve themselves in an obvious way. And, there's a famous story about Potter Stewart, who was a Associate Justice of the Supreme Court appointed by Eisenhower, who authored many of the early obscenity rulings, which opened up the First Amendment to what had previously been seen as obscenity. And somebody asked him, a journalist, I think, Mr. Justice Stewart, how do you define obscenity? And his famous definition was, I know it when I see it. And there's a lot of that with what I read. But the other irony is you would be shocked, or maybe not, at how few people in Hollywood read. It is really, they might rely on a synopsis, they might rely on a pitch, they might rely on anything. But in terms of actually reading the underlying material, it's pathetic. And I used to go to panels and symposiums and whatever, and someone would inevitably ask me, so, Mr. Bookman, you have a new piece of material that you're going into the marketplace to sell. What's your process? And I'd say, well, I do something I'm pretty sure no other Hollywood agent does. The first thing I do is read it. And it would always get kind of a nervous laugh. But it's true. And again, behind my back. And it's just, I'm not proud of this. People say, oh, Bob Bookman, he reads, as though our business isn't driven by the written word. And when I was a studio executive, the word that was used to basically say that whatever I was interested in couldn't be commercial, and this is maybe the worst thing you can call someone in Hollywood, intellectual. So
As if that's
when I
bad.
went back to the agency business, you could be anything short, as we've seen, of a child molester, and still be people have to deal with you because of what you control. But when you're a studio executive, it might be different.
Uh, and does that apply, the sort of not reading thing? Does that apply to whether it's like books that might inform a movie, or even like screenplays themselves, or
Oh yeah,
scripts, or
I when I was at Columbia Pictures, I had worked for a man named Guy McElwain, who had actually been my boss at ICM. And he was one of the nicest men and one of the most incompetent men to ever run a major studio. And we had a meeting with Bernie Brillstein, the famous Bernie Brillstein, because we had a project with Bernie, and the meeting was to discuss the script. And Bernie asked, I'll never forget this, asked Guy about a specific scene. And Guy rambled on about what he thought about the scene. The problem was the scene wasn't in the script.
That's sort of an important gap, isn't it? Like,
Yeah, pretty
probably.
much.
Um, kind of like keeping in along the lines of the book stuff. Like, so how do you, if you're looking specifically, maybe assessing a project, whether it's a book or something else, but like, how can, and you might like it, you might say it gets you super excited. This is very cool. But how do you discern between a project that maybe just needs more time and maybe it's not ready, but it needs more time to ripen on the vine, and something that realistically you have to assess and say, okay, I really dig this, but realistically, based on what I know about this business, it's probably never going to happen. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, are you talking about me as a producer or as an agent?
Good question. I'll say both.
Well, because they're separate answers. So as an agent, you know, first of all, if it's a book and you're going out with it, let's say in manuscript form, you are up against the clock that once it gets out to foreign publishers, you're not going to have control of it. It's just going to be out there, much less when it's published, you're not going to control it. Or on the other hand, you could see if you don't sell it early, you have a second bite of the apple. So I'll give you an example of, ironically, a book I sold that still has not been made, but it's one of my favorite unmade projects, and it's called Agent Zigzag. And it was the first big Ben McIntyre book about English, you know, the war and so forth. And it dealt with a man named Eddie Redman, who was the a triple agent for the English, the Germans, and himself. And it's just an extraordinary, stranger than fiction story. He's one of those Eddie Chapman. He's one of those great characters that, you know, perfect for an actor to play. And I couldn't sell it, and I was going crazy. And I had an offer, not a very high one, from an English producer. And I was thinking, do I have to make this deal? And the New York Times reviews the book, and it says, Agent Zigzag may be the greatest World War II thriller since Casablanca. And now suddenly the phones are ringing out off the hook, even people that had passed on it before, right? And so, oh my God, this is amazing. And I ended up, and this was the last time this ever happened, having my two final bidders, Warner Brothers and New Line. I say it never happened again because they're both owned by the same company. So they were bidding against themselves. And they paid $1 million up front for it. And that's one reason it hasn't been made. Even though I got a reversion for Ben, which meant after 7 years, the rights went back to him, there's still a lien on the rights. So there's now $4 or $5 million against it. And that's the challenge, to figure out how to get it made and somehow make Warner Brothers and the buyer comfortable with what it's going to cost.
What's another like really promising story that never made it to film? It sort of died on the vine, and but you were really behind the story and loved it.
Well, you know, I'm sure if I looked at my list there, you know, there are a large number of them. Well, I mean, I sold Philip Kerr, who I loved, who wrote Berlin Noir. And in fact, it's finally getting made after more than 40 years. I sold any number of his books outright. And literally, I think 5 consecutive books all outright, and none ever got made. I had lunch with the executive at Warner Brothers this week to try, because they bought the book, to let me see if I can get it made right now, because they've been sitting on it for 30 years.
Wow. I think that's one thing that is kind of shocking. It certainly was to me. I don't think most people would suspect is like how the timeline of these projects could be measured in multiple decades.
Yeah.
There's kind of a perception that I think, somebody has a great script or a great story, and or maybe it does stem literally from a novel or something, but
Yeah.
then it gets thrown into this machine, and out pops the big hit. But there's so many machinations behind the scenes, and it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but like the number one, or maybe one of the most important factors to determining whether something will actually get made is ultimately, is somebody willing to, from a financing perspective, willing to take on that risk to really push it over the goal line. Is that
Mhm.
kind of accurate?
Well, I mean, it depends who that finance person is. It depends what the budget is. Again, there's so many variables in a given situation, and it may be when the casting come together, and because a lot of times the offers are contingent on casting approval. So if you don't have someone, then the offer to finance the film just doesn't come together because you don't have the cast, and then you may have the cast later. I mean, I'll give you another sort of stranger than fiction story, which was, you mentioned Silence of the Lambs. That was another book I couldn't sell. I mean, I was just, nobody was interested because Manhunter had been a failure that Michael Mann had directed with Brian Cox, of all people. And serial killer stories were just on the out, right? And so I'm just love this. And I hear that Paramount has passed on it. And I knew Ned Tannen, who was head of Paramount at the time, and I knew he'd read coverage. He hadn't read the book, right? And I called him and I said, Ned, I've never asked you this again. I know that you got negative coverage on Silence of the Lambs. I'm just asking for you to give the book to a different reader who you trust, who has a different sensibility, and see what they say. He goes, that's fair. He calls me 3 days later, says, well, I gave it to the other reader. It came back highly recommended. We're still not buying it.
Wow.
That's what you have to
And
deal
then
with.
what?
And then you have to, how do I get around? And I'm, again, sometimes you'll work for months and months and months and nothing will happen. In this case, I'm sitting in my office. Fred Spector, my dear colleague who turned 93 years young 2 weeks ago, comes into my office and says, are Silence of the Lambs still available? And I go, yeah. He goes, Gene Hackman wants to buy it. I go, really? Yeah, he wants to direct and star in it. And he's got Arthur Krim at Orion putting up half the money. Make a deal with Orion. I go, great. So that's how I ended up selling it. And then a few weeks later, Fred came in and he said, you won't believe it. I go, what? He goes, Gene's daughter read the book and said, Daddy, you're not making this movie. And then Orion bought out Gene's half, which he was happy to swallow himself. And the rest is history.
It's so, if it weren't for that element happening at the end, the buyout, but also Gene Hackman's initial interest, perhaps it still would be
Yeah.
unreleased.
Yeah.
It's crazy because I think there's a certain sense of inevitability, especially with landmark movies that everybody knows and has impacted society. Really the common touch points, movies that you can quote to anybody, or
Yeah.
they'll know what you're talking about. But how tenuous the difference is between a world changing blockbuster and something that just didn't even come to fruition. You kind of talked about like the importance of like during this whole pipeline of movies being made, like being aware that, oh well, Paramount or some studio has turned this down, or there's been some other development in this
Yeah.
concentric world of Hollywood. So I imagine back in the day, maybe certainly the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, this was very much driven by sort of maybe gossip or stories, for lack of a better term. Your relationships you talked about, like having dinner with somebody or lunch, and hearing through the grapevine that yes, Paramount has turned down XYZ film. Of course, now we live in this information age where information is exchanged instantaneously through email or other forms. Do you find that this whole process of discovery around films happens faster? In other words, you might be aware that something important has happened with a potential film much faster, or is it still kind of a little bit old school in the sense that it is just very much this information is exchanged over lunches, and it's not quite as like high paced as maybe one would be given to believe.
Yeah, I think it clearly is faster, but what I like to say is we made pretty good movies back in those days. But I digress. Oh, I think that there's truth in that, but also the accuracy of the information. Information can spread, but garbage in, garbage out. You don't necessarily know
Right.
it's reliable. And also, the other fun thing you reminded me of is excuses. So you submit a piece of material that the studio allegedly really likes. They're going to look for the most anodyne excuse to pass on it so they don't jeopardize their relationship with you. Oh, we love this, but we have something similar in development. Oh, really? What's that? And then when they tell you, that isn't at all similar.
Well, at least they're couching it in nice terms. They don't want to hurt your feelings.
Yeah.
But you
I,
must have to get pretty used to that
oh,
dynamic.
yeah. Oh, I'll give you a great story like that. A Cameron Crowe, who I represented for a very, very long time, and I sold Jerry Maguire. And what people don't know is that Jerry Maguire was written for Tom Hanks, and Tom Hanks passed on it. And after Tom Hanks passed on it, Cameron rewrote it for Tom Cruise, and the rest, again, is history. And someone ran into Tom Hanks years later and said, wasn't Jerry Maguire written for you? How come you didn't make the movie? You know what he said? Availability conflict.
I wonder what he thought looking back on it. Like, wow, that
I
would have
don't
been
know. I don't know. He's done pretty well without that. But I'm going to tell you a story that was told to me by the legendary director Joe Mankiewicz about why Hollywood is so fascinating to people. So Joe Mankiewicz was born in the East. And his older brother wrote Citizen Kane. Herman was 12 years older than Joe. Anyway, Joe's father was a Jewish immigrant. I think he was a professor, but he hung out with really important people like Einstein and Steinmetz and all those kinds of people. And every month, those guys got together and just had a meeting and talked about what was ever on their mind. And all Joe ever wanted to be was a fly on the wall at one of those meetings. And his father would say, forget it, no outsiders, don't ask me again, it's not going to happen. Joe goes off to Hollywood, comes back, a very celebrated screenwriter originally. And one of these meetings is about to take place. So he cajoles his father and he says, okay, here's the deal. You walk in behind me, you don't say a word, you sit down and you listen. Dad, I'm there. He sits down, and Joe told me the story, and Albert Einstein spots him. And he says, Joe, tell me, what's Joan Crawford really like? And he said for the next hour, they peppered him with questions about Hollywood, and he never got to hear the geniuses speak.
I did not expect Albert Einstein to pop up in this conversation, Bob. That's awesome.
Oh, the other great, because it's funny that Albert Einstein got a tour of Warner Brothers by Jack Warner. And Jack Warner supposedly said to him, Professor, I hear you have a theory of relatives. I have a theory of relatives too. I can't stand them.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, this is a man that sort of had figured out the fabric of the universe, but Einstein, but was still fascinated by just like the magic of movie making. It's that storytelling thing. It's such like a
Yeah.
primal thing. Maybe going back to when we were just living on the savannas and the plains, gathering around a fire. There's something very instinctual about the need to share stories and relate to other people.
Yeah, we
One other
don't
story
know.
question.
I was just going to say, and we don't know, if you will, how Greek theater came to be, because clearly it just didn't happen out of nowhere. And Greek theater, in a sense, is the ancient version of movies today.
Great point, which arguably still informs a lot of filmmaking. I mean, there's that saying that there's only there's only a select few fundamental story types. There's man
Yeah,
against
Sydney
himself,
used
man
to
against
say seven.
nature.
Yes, Sydney
Seven,
said
yeah.
there are only seven.
And I'll bet the ancient Greeks had probably figured out a fair number of those. Certainly the tragedy, the Greek tragedy, which is,
Probably all seven, because a lot of Greek theater obviously hasn't survived.
yeah, good point. Bob, you mentioned some amazing movies that you've been involved with. I would be remiss if I didn't mention Jurassic Park because this is another one of those generational touchstone movies.
Yeah.
Really, just such a big impact. But so how did this work out? Did you know Michael Crichton prior to kind of helping turn Jurassic Park into a film? Because Michael Crichton certainly was a known entity at the time. He
Oh,
had
yeah.
some,
I first represented Michael in, I'm going to say, 1976. And what had happened was that Lynn Nesbitt, who was my closest colleague in the ICM New York Publications Department, I mean, Lynn, God bless her, still going strong, but she represented Michael Crichton, Tom Wolfe, John Gregory Dunn, Joe Esterhaz, Cameron Crowe, Nora Ephron. And when I stepped into the role, thanks to Marvin Josephson, who was the head of the agency, of representing the rights to all the material that the New York Publications Department represented, that's how I suddenly all these were my clients. I mean, it was the most extraordinary thing that happened to me in my career. So that actually is how, but ironically, Michael was represented for rights by Chase and Park Citron, which was an old spin-off agency from MCA, and the three founders were all, even at that time, like 70. George Chasen, I knew well, was extraordinary. So Lynn sent me a manuscript called Coma by an unknown writer named Robin Cook, who in fact was an ophthalmologist who worshiped Michael Crichton and wanted to emulate him. So she sent me the book and I read it and I thought, this could be a great Michael Crichton movie. And I sent it to Michael. He loved it, attached himself to it, and then said, I want you to represent me because you're the first person who ever sent me a piece of material I wanted to direct. So that's how, and so I represented him in various books that he wrote between then and I'm going to say 1980, when I think is when he delivered Jurassic Park. Now, what was going on at the same time then is Mike Ovitz, remember I'm at CAA now, Mike Ovitz wants to sign Steven Spielberg. And Steven Spielberg, on the other hand, had approached me, I'm going to say 2 years before, and you'll just see how bizarrely this played out, and said, did Michael Crichton write a script called ER? And I said, yeah, he wrote it a really long time ago, and it's been in his trunk because it feels more like television than a film. He said, I've read that script and I've gotten Warner Brothers, interestingly, not Universal, because Universal was where Steven made almost all of his movies, because I've got Warner Brothers to agree to option it from you. And we're going to have Michael rewrite it and see if we can get it made. So now they have a relationship. Here comes Jurassic Park. And I know that because Mike Ovitz wants to sign Steven Spielberg, he has to be the one who gets it. And I know that because Steven Spielberg has been courting Michael Crichton, that Michael is going to have a special interest. But I also have to make it feel that I've been fair and opened the book to other offers. So what I did was I ended up getting 4 directors committed to it at 4 different studios, all at the same price, because I didn't want it to be about money. I wanted it to be about a creative decision by Michael Crichton. He then got on the phone with all 4 directors to hear their creative approaches, and shockingly went with Steven Spielberg. And Michael Ovitz then signed Steven Spielberg. I, obviously got a lot of acclaim, if you will, or whatever, for having made that deal. And it was needless, and you'll be shocked to hear that after we closed the deal, ER disappeared from development at Warner Brothers. But when several years later, Tony Krantz, who had been an agent in the television department at CAA, came by my office and said, I've been instructed to go around to all the motion picture literary agents' offices to see if there's anything on the shelf that might be a pilot or TV series. And I said, well, there's this script called ER. And that's how it got sold, set up at Warner Brothers, because it was already there. And that's why Steven Spielberg was involved in it, because he was already attached to it. And between Steven and Michael, they split 35% of the gross, when that really meant something.
Wow, that's fascinating about ER. I actually never knew that
Yeah.
backstory, that it started as potentially a film. Um, and it sounds like with Spielberg and Jurassic Park, you sort of were able to use your 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 relationships with those guys, and knowing the inner workings of, like, you sort of connected those lines, and
Yeah.
or connected those two entities. You're like, okay, this would make a lot of sense. The four directors that you had in mind, that, I guess, A, who were the other three guys, and B, were you actually silently? It sounds like you were silently rooting for Spielberg to be the actual winner the whole time.
I would, I don't know if rooting was it, but let's just say I was hoping that would be the outcome. And I was highly confident it would be, just based on my conversations with Michael. And I was very above I wasn't trying to even subtly suggest to Michael that one was better than the other. I said, you have to treat all four equally, listen to what their pitches are, and then decide. And that way, by the way, speaking selfishly, I couldn't be blamed, because everybody's looking to blame the agent when they don't get something. You can't imagine the things I was blamed for. But here, no one's going to blame a writer for making a creative decision. So
That makes
that,
sense. Yeah.
yeah. So it really wasn't a surprise. But, and I mean, I'll give you another example of something like that. Was a horse. Remember the Horse Whisperer?
I've not seen that one.
Yeah, Robert Redford, directed and starred in it, and that was a book by a totally unknown author. And I was cultivating co-agency relationships in London at the time. So we're now talking early '90s, I think. And I'm going over there ironically because my first wife was French. And after we divorced, she moved back to France with our son. And I wanted to see if I could see him as often as possible. And I thought, if I could somehow develop business in London, I'd get over at least twice a year and I could see him. And he's been here since 2003, and my business in London has only blossomed. Anyway, so the agents that I've been courting call me and they say there's a book called The Horse Whisperer, and half of it in manuscript leaked at the Frankfurt Book Festival. And we have a couple of offers. Scott Rudin wants to buy it for $50,000. What do you think? I said, well, will you let me read it? So they send it to me, and I say, I think that this book could sell for a lot more than $50,000. Can I be your co-agent? Sure. So long story, I end up getting the ideal four offers. I have Peter Guber negotiating against John Peters, because they're not together anymore. And I have Robert Redford negotiating against Sidney Pollack. And I established a ceiling of $3 million. If everybody offers $3 million, you get on the phone with Nick Evans. That was the name of the author. And the English agent said, why are you stopping at $3 million? They were going to take 50,000. Why are you stopping at $3 million? We could get more. I said, the last big deal like this that was made was a book that sold for $3.25 million by John, writes all the medical thrillers. I sentimental blog. Anyway, so if we sell it for more than 3.25, the deal's going to get reviewed, not the book. If you want the book reviewed, then let's take $3 million and be happy with it. And again, I got Nick on the phone with, all four of them. And John Peters, it turned out, was in his private plane circling the airport so he could be the last one to talk to Nick. And shockingly, when Robert Redford said, "I want to star and direct in the film," he chose Redford.
Wow. So it sounds like that was sort of, from your perspective, it was kind of a best case scenario where you had many interested parties
Yeah,
kind
that
of
was absolutely best case
essentially bidding it
scenario.
up. I imagine sometimes it's not quite so easy.
Right. No, it's often the opposite. I mean, if especially when you only have one buyer as opposed to say two, because you have very little leverage.
As we kind of wrap this up, maybe we could call this the reflection portion of the show, kind of thinking on stuff, and also maybe a little bit more bringing it back to the present. But like, okay, so your entity, you have Smarty Pants Ventures.
Yes.
This is what you're
Just to
doing
be
now.
clear, Smarty Pants was my beloved late dog.
That's a great tribute to
And,
a beloved
and when I
canine.
told my attorney that that's what I was going to call the company, he said, "I don't think that's a very serious name." And I said, "I do."
What's the alternative? Something very forgettable and boring.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah.
Predictable.
So
Right.
the advice there is don't do the opposite of what attorneys say when it comes to
Oh, yeah. Oh,
naming.
yeah. Or just do the opposite of what the, mainstream is doing.
Absolutely, zig when
Yeah.
others zag. But yeah, tell me about the day when you decided to start Smarty Pants. Like, what was the catalyst for that?
I mean, the catalyst was that I had been at CAA for 27 years. I had then been at an agency called Paradigm because that gave me an opportunity to learn the television business because at CAA, as I said, it was church and state, one or the other. And when the 4 years was about to be up, I realized it was my last chance to do something for myself and that I really, really wanted to see if I could get films produced that I believed in. And I, on good advice, set up a small management company at the same time, which I still have, which is screenwriters who I'd represented as an agent, but not any additional ones, and IP creators. And I've only added a couple of people there who've approached me rather than me approaching because I wanted to focus on the producing side. And I had a partnership with two partners, and then we got hit, as we said, by COVID and all those other things. And at the end of 4 years, we had two seasons of Mosquito Coast on Apple. We had a limited series that I'm really proud of called The Spy Among Friends, which was on MGM Plus here, based on a Ben McIntyre book, in fact. And the third one was the Dylan movie. But that wasn't enough to support, even with our small overhead, three partners in a company. And also, I had brought in all three of those projects. So we split up, and then I got this unbelievably fortuitous opportunity to be on the lot at Sony. And I've just not looked back because obviously I'm not getting any younger, and I want to be able to leave a mark on things that where I was passionate about, and because of me, they happened. And as great an agent as you are, ultimately you're just a representative.
So I noticed, yeah, your address is the literally the Sony lot. In this day and age, how much does your physical location for your offices matter? Like you're in the heart of a studio environment. I imagine it sounds like that still makes a difference. You're in close physical proximity to all this, as opposed to you think, well, if a lot of stuff happens, via email or phone, maybe it doesn't matter so much. But it sounds like that would be a flawed assumption.
I think psychologically, most importantly, I mean, I just love being on the lot. I'm not there today because I have things near where I live that I have to do, and it's Friday. A lot of times people don't go in on Friday. But psychologically, and secondly, it's just that I have opportunities because I have relationships there. And the final thing, which you're going to laugh is, and I may be wrong about this, I think people who ordinarily might not want to have lunch with me when they find out it's on the lot can't wait to set a date.
Come on in, check it out.
Yeah,
It's a very
exactly.
exciting thing to be in a studio.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, you'll have to come to the lot for lunch when you come to LA.
would love to. I haven't actually been out to LA for a long time. As long as I can survive the traffic, I would.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll help
that,
you.
that sounds like a wonderful. All right. Um, kind of like as we get close to wrapping up here. So kind of like considering where things are today in Hollywood. Let's say you're 30 or 35 years old today, and you have perhaps your law background, but you haven't actually been in Hollywood. Well, you have the same instincts. Would you go into the business today, given the current kind of state of the industry and where it's headed, or if not Hollywood, would you be inclined to perhaps do something else?
I think, it's so hard to say things what I would have done and or what I would do now because you have your whole life experience that you can't just suddenly deny or block out. And so knowing how Hollywood, if for want of a better way of defining it, was when I started versus how it is now, I don't think I would. But the question is, I don't know what I would do differently and what else I would do. I mean, I didn't practice of law a day in my life, even though I went to law school and actually passed the California bar. But it's been a huge asset to me in many ways. And maybe something being, I'd like to think I have an entrepreneurial side. Maybe I could find partners and start a company of some sort that deals with something creative. But it's just so hard to know. It's a really hard question to answer. But the business has really, really changed.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical for sure. Kind of a related question, like knowing what you know now after this sort of epic career, like what advice would you give to younger Bob who is just starting out in the industry, making that pivotal decision to really, get involved and eventually led you to CAA and all that. What advice would you impart to young Bob?
Well, the great Ray Kurtzman, who was everybody's sort of if you want to know what the right thing to do was, you asked Ray and he told you the right thing to do. He was sort of inside counsel at CAA. He had originally been in business affairs at Columbia and William Morris and so forth. And Ray, for many years, was the first line of interviewing if you wanted to work at CAA. And when you would meet with Ray, he'd say, "What are you doing here? I mean, I've read your resume. You have great credentials. Why waste it in this business? It's just going to chew you up and spit you out. Take my advice and do something different." And unless they were, no, this is what I want, I'm determined to do that, then you might have a chance. Because in a sense, he was saying, if you're not really, really, really committed to this, it's not right for you. And I think everybody takes their own path, especially successful people. I think it's rare to find parallel identical paths taken, but I think you can't go wrong starting out as an assistant at a major agency for want of something else, because you see everything that's going on, everything passes through the agencies. You even have a sense of what department you might want to be in and make a transition there if you can. And from there, because of, again, relationships, people that you're able to meet, it'll give you an opportunity to go up to the next level. When I started out, I mean, I got all these, it was a downturn in the business, and I got all these, attaboy, you can't fail, good luck, I don't have anything to offer to you. And I had been passed by two of the top three agencies. My last interview was with Frank Konigsberg at IFA, as it was then called. Later, 2 years later, became half of ICM. And I loved Frank, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, I'm sitting on his couch and he says, my administrative assistant left intelligent packaging, left last week to take an entry level job at CBS. How would you like to start Monday? That was it. I
Wow.
was in the right place at the right time with the right opening. Otherwise, I don't know.
I guess another way to phrase that is you really have to create your own luck.
Exactly.
And
Preparation and
really, it sounds
opportunity.
a little cliched.
Yeah.
Yeah, believe in yourself,
Yeah.
have that heart. Um, well, great, Bob. Lastly, final question here,
Yeah.
and we actually like to close every episode the same way, but it kind of zooming out and taking the it's kind of a fun way to distill everything down. But like, if every overview listener were to walk away from this conversation today, remembering just one thing, what would that one thing be?
I would say the one thing that they need to be is that to say, when I was first starting out in the business, somebody said to me, you know, Bob, there are two kinds of careers in the movie business, long ones and short ones. And when you're young, that sounds obvious. But the longer you work, you realize it's not easy to have a long career. And what does it take to have a long career? And it basically is, who are you? How do people see you? Who do you know? It's all these issues sort of put together. I often say, as an example to young people, I said, let's say that you're building a mosaic and you have a wood frame and all these colored stones outside it. Every time you have an interaction with somebody, conversation, phone call, email, whatever, a stone goes inside the frame. And pretty soon an image appears. And once the image appears, it's all but impossible to change. So decide now what your image has to be and adhere to it. And that has to be trust. It has to be transparency. It has to be authenticity. I mean, it has to be all these, you could argue, moral positions to take that, unless you're under stress, are pretty easy to adhere to, but people somehow don't. You know, the number of times I still get lied to, but that's a guarantee for a short career. You want to have a long career, and what does it take for me to have a long career?
And what strikes me, Bob, with this mosaic idea is it's really universally applicable to
Yeah,
anything in life.
yeah,
I mean, you
exactly.
think, yeah, I think maybe it's one reason why sometimes if even if somebody kind of gives you a little negative vibe, nothing too bad, but it's like it can kind of leave that negative impression. And whereas some people, you just have their mosaic is so positive, and
Mhm.
that's a great way to approach life. Um, wow, it's awesome stories, life lessons from Bob. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. I got to say, like your enthusiasm for the craft and for the art of what you do is infectious, and it's a great reminder to just I think follow your heart and do what excites you, because clearly it's brought you to some great places and also led to amazing films. So thank you so much for joining us,
Thanks for inviting me, Kent. I really enjoyed it.
and thank you everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time. Stay curious. Take care.